What you know about William Wallace is probably a romanticized version, shaped by movies and heroic tales. But the truth is much darker and more shocking than imagination allows. In 1305, on the streets of London, one of the greatest symbols of Scottish resistance faced a fate so brutal it defies any modern understanding. Wallace's execution was not just a death, but a calculated spectacle of torture and public humiliation. Unlike the glorious hero Hollywood shows us, Wallace was subjected to the cruelest method reserved for traitors. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, with every detail designed to destroy his dignity, his humanity, and to send a clear message to all who dared challenge the power of Edward I. What few people know is that his trial was a legal theater, a farce conducted in Latin, which he barely understood, accusing him of treason against a king he never recognized as his sovereign. His capture involved betrayal by close allies, showing how fear and politics can cruelly intertwine. Wallace's march through the streets, bound and humiliated, before crowds who reveled in his suffering, reveals how calculated the propaganda of the time was and how intense the attempt was to erase his memory. But the impact of this execution was paradoxical. Instead of crushing the Scottish resistance, it turned Wallace into a martyr, inspiring future leaders and shaping the identity of a nation. In today's video, we will reveal details of his death so horrifying that the final revelation will truly impact you, showing that real history can be much more terrifying than any fiction. So subscribe now and leave your like, because every subscription helps the channel grow, brings more controversial and mysterious stories, and allows us to continue investigating and sharing history without filters. If you can, support us even more with a super thanks, but if not, just comment on what surprised you most in this story. Every interaction helps us immensely. Stay until the end, because the truth behind William Wallace's execution will shake everything you thought you knew about heroism, power, and cruelty in the Middle Ages. 1305 marked a decisive moment for both England and Scotland, a time when the streets of London teemed with merchants, soldiers, and travelers, but also carried an air of political tension that went far beyond everyday commerce. Medieval Europe was organized into kingdoms and fiefdoms, and the notion of a nation as we understand it today was still taking shape. In this setting, Scotland was seen by the English King Edward I, known as Longshanks, not as a sovereign nation, but as a rebellious province that needed to be controlled with an iron fist. To understand what happened to William Wallace during this period, it is essential to delve into this context, where power was contested not only with armies, but also through symbols and brutal displays of authority. Scotland was experiencing a crisis of identity and leadership. The death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286, followed by that of his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, left the country without a clear heir to the throne. This opened the door for Edward I to intervene, offering himself as the arbiter of the succession. However, the English king was not merely interested in helping. He wanted to ensure his supremacy and turn Scotland into a submissive territory. Thus, the political vacuum quickly became fertile ground for internal disputes among Scottish nobles and, consequently, an opportunity for English advancement. It was in this environment that Wallace emerged. He was not a high-ranking noble, but a common man who, motivated by personal loss and a desire for freedom, led a resistance against English rule. In 1297, his victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge showed that the Scots could defeat even England's feared heavy cavalry. This victory held immense symbolic value, reigniting the spirit of independence and proving that resistance was not just a desperate act, but a real possibility for change. However, Edward I's fury was relentless. The king had experience in dealing with rebellions, such as in Wales, where he crushed resistance movements with brutality, and he was now determined to do the same in Scotland. In the following years, Wallace became more than a military leader. He transformed into a symbol of opposition, a constant reminder that Scotland was not fully subdued. and this represented a problem both for Edward and for the Scottish nobility itself, most of whom preferred to submit to English power to preserve their lands and privileges. By 1305, the situation was clear. Many nobles had sworn loyalty to the English king, and the figure of Wallace represented not only rebellion, but also shame for those who had yielded. He was a man out of place, a hero to the people, but a nuisance to the elites seeking to survive amid English pressure. Wallace's capture was not a simple military act. It was the result of years of pursuit, espionage, and betrayals. Edward I understood perfectly the symbolic value of neutralizing this figure, and therefore dedicated considerable resources to finding him. When Wallace was finally handed over to the English, likely due to betrayal by other Scots, it was not merely the arrest of a rebel. It was a victory for English propaganda, an announcement that even the greatest symbol of resistance could not escape the king's reach. This is the backdrop that explains the violence and cruelty that would follow. The context of 1305 was not just a moment when a man was sentenced to death. It was an era when authority was imposed through spectacle, when kings believed that collective fear was the best weapon against future uprisings. London, a vibrant city full of life, became the stage for this demonstration of power, drawing crowds to witness Wallace's fate. Every detail of the capture, trial, and execution was calculated to send a clear message. Challenging the King of England was to sign one's own death warrant in the most humiliating and painful way possible. Thus, understanding the context of 1305 is to realize that Wallace's fate was shaped not only by his personal choices, but by the clash between two visions of power. On one side, the Scottish desire to assert its autonomy and identity. On the other, the English determination to consolidate its dominion. In this conflict, Wallace became a central figure, not because he sought personal glory, but because his example inspired others to imagine a free Scotland. For Edward I, this was intolerable. For the common Scots, it was a call to hope. This tension, woven from betrayals, battles, and dreams of freedom, explains why 1305 became a decisive year in Scottish history, and why Wallace's execution ultimately echoed far beyond his time, marking future generations with the memory that even the greatest suffering cannot erase the value of fighting for independence. The trial of William Wallace, held on August 23, 1305, in Westminster Hall, was one of the most significant moments of his life, but also one of the most unjust and theatrical in medieval history. From the beginning, there was no intention of offering him a legitimate defense or conducting the proceedings impartially. In fact, the entire trial was carefully staged as a political spectacle, a piece of theater designed to legitimize the decision already made by King Edward I, to destroy Wallace not only as a man, but also as a symbol of Scottish resistance. The choice of location, Westminster Hall, was no accident. It was one of the most solemn seats of English power, a place where decisions of great impact were proclaimed. There, the grandeur of the setting helped reinforce the message of authority and inevitability. The judges present were not neutral figures, but authorities directly linked to the king, men committed to ensuring that the sentence followed the crown's wishes exactly. The language used in the trial, Latin, was likely not understood by Wallace, which itself demonstrated the exclusionary nature of the process. Even without understanding all the technical details, he knew well what the outcome would be, as his capture had already been celebrated as a political victory in London. Yet, his demeanor was marked by firmness and courage. Accused of crimes such as treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and countless other offenses against the English crown, Wallace was not intimidated. He clearly stated that he could not be considered a traitor because he had never recognized Edward I as his sovereign. This response, simple yet powerful, challenged the very basis of the accusation, as the crime of treason required a relationship of vassalage and submission to the king. His statement was an act of resistance in the midst of the farce. The trial was not meant to ascertain the truth, but to clothe a predetermined sentence in legality. The listed crimes were not just legal charges. They were narratives created to transform him, in the eyes of English public opinion, from a warrior into a common criminal. The inclusion of charges like sacrilege sought to associate him with the figure of an enemy not only of the crown but also of religion, intensifying the idea that he represented chaos and disorder. Everything was carefully orchestrated so that the ultimate punishment would be seen as not only legitimate but necessary. The final sentence was read with solemnity. Wallace would be dragged through the streets of London, hanged but not to the point of death, then drawn and quartered, with his body parts displayed in different locations. This cruel ritual had symbolic meaning at every stage, as if the condemned man's own body was being used to convey political and social messages. Throughout the trial, Wallace maintained his dignity. He did not beg for mercy, nor try to evade the consequences. His demeanor transformed the theater of humiliation into a scene of resistance, and although King Edward's intention was to erase his influence, the trial ultimately reinforced Wallace's image as a hero. The entire process revealed far more about the political mentality of the time than about Wallace's own actions. The goal was not to deliver justice, but to teach a lesson to the Scottish people and anyone else who dared challenge English authority. Thus, the trial of William Wallace is remembered not as an example of law, but as a symbol of the abuse of power disguised as legality. And it was precisely this contradiction that, over time, helped transform Wallace into a martyr, remembered not for the unjust condemnation, but for the courage to face his fate without denying the fight for Scotland's freedom. When we talk about the sentence of William Wallace, it is impossible not to perceive how it was designed to be much more than just a punishment. At that time, in the early 14th century, executions were not merely a means of eliminating someone considered dangerous, but also a form of public spectacle and an instrument of power. And in the case of Wallace, King Edward I, known as Longshanks, wanted to turn the condemnation into a clear message for all who dared to challenge English authority. The sentence given to him was the cruelest that existed at the time: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved solely for those considered traitors to the king. The choice of this method was no accident, but rather a carefully thought-out strategy to destroy not only the man, but also the symbol he had become for the Scots. Wallace had been accused of treason against Edward, which carried a cruel irony, since he never recognized the English monarch as his sovereign. When given the chance to defend himself at the trial, Wallace made this clear. He could not be a traitor to a king who was never his king. This firm and courageous response, although it had no power to change the outcome, reinforced his image of resistance. The court, composed of judges chosen directly by Edward, had already decided the Scots' fate. The sentence was read solemnly, laden with symbolism, and each part of the punishment had a purpose beyond inflicting pain. Being drawn through the streets, tied to a wooden structure dragged by horses, represented complete humiliation, the loss of dignity, and the debasement of someone who had dared to stand against the king. The hanging, which would be the second step, was carried out in a calculated manner to avoid a quick death. The goal was not to break the neck in seconds, but to cause suffocation, leaving the victim at death's door only to be cut down before the end arrived. Then came the cruelest part: the disembowelment, while still alive, and the burning of the organs before the condemned man's eyes. This act held profound symbolism for medieval people, as it was believed that the entrails represented sentiments such as compassion and courage. Burning them in front of their owner was like destroying the person's humanity. Finally, the body would be decapitated and divided into 4 parts, known as quarters. Each piece would be sent to a different city, serving as a physical and visible reminder that rebellion had an unthinkable price. Thus, Wallace's sentence was not limited to ending his life. It sought to erase his memory, destroy his honor, and plant fear in all who might follow his example. But curiously, This attempt at symbolic annihilation had the opposite effect. Although the intention was to intimidate, the limitless cruelty ended up creating a martyr. The detail that Wallace maintained his dignity until the end, that he did not beg and did not deny his cause, meant that his death was remembered as proof of courage, not defeat. The sentence that was meant to bury his struggle ended up, paradoxically, fueling the desire for freedom among the Scots even more. And that is why, to this day, when we speak of the execution of William Wallace, what stands out is not only the unimaginable violence of his condemnation, but also the strength of a man who accepted the highest price in the name of what he believed in. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 was one of the most brutal and emblematic of the Middle Ages, marked by planned cruelty and a clear intention to make an example of a man for an entire nation. On August 23rd, London prepared for the spectacle as if organizing a festival. Streets filled with curious onlookers, vendors offering food and drink, children and adults jostling to get a close look at the fate of the Scottish leader who had dared to challenge King Edward I of England. Wallace, already weakened after weeks of public humiliation, was tied to a kind of wooden panel called a hurdle and dragged through the streets of London from the Tower to Smithfield. The route was designed to be long and painful, with his body scraping against the stones, which tore off pieces of skin and left a trail of blood along the way. The crowd did not just watch, they actively participated, with boos, insults, and even trash being thrown at him. Upon arriving at the execution site, before an even larger and more excited audience, the true horror began. The first act was hanging, but not the quick, neck-snapping kind. The rope was adjusted to cause slow suffocation, making Wallace struggle, turn purple, and nearly lose consciousness. Just as he was about to die, he was cut down, still alive. The second act was the cruelest, dissection. The executioner opened his abdomen and began removing his internal organs, displaying each one to the public before throwing them into a fire burning beside the scaffold. In the medieval mindset, the entrails were associated with emotion and compassion. Burning them before Wallace's eyes was a symbolic gesture of destroying his humanity and reducing him to a soulless criminal. Witnesses reported screams of pain so intense that they scarred all who were present. Despite this, many also noted that he never begged for mercy, maintaining a firm countenance until the end. The final act was decapitation, done with a swift axe blow. His already torn body was then quartered into 4 parts, each sent to different Scottish cities, Stirling, Perth, and Berwick, serving as a physical reminder of English power and the consequence of rebellion. His head, preserved in tar, was displayed on a spike on London Bridge, a place everyone entering or leaving the city passed by. Thus, for years, Wallace continued to watch over the English capital, but now as a macabre trophy. This execution was not merely an act of punishment. It was a carefully staged spectacle, designed to be remembered for generations and to instill fear in anyone who dared challenge royal power. However, the effect ultimately proved to be the opposite of what Edward I intended. If at first the terror paralyzed some, the sheer, exaggerated cruelty soon turned Wallace into a martyr, a symbol of resistance and courage. His memory would inspire other leaders, like Robert the Bruce, and further strengthen the Scottish struggle for freedom. Thus, Wallace's execution not only marked the end of his life, but also the beginning of his eternity as a legend, showing that brutality may attempt to destroy a body, but it often ends up immortalizing an ideal. After the brutal execution of William Wallace in 1305, the story of his body did not end the moment the executioner's axe separated his head from his body. In fact, the fate of the Scottish warrior's remains was carefully planned to carry a political message even stronger than the execution itself. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, wanted every piece of Wallace to become a physical and lasting warning against any future attempts at rebellion. For this reason, Wallace's body was treated not as a simple corpse, but as an instrument of propaganda, a cruel means of communication used by the royal power. Wallace's head was preserved in tar, a common method to prevent decomposition and prolong public exposure, and was then placed on a spike atop London Bridge. This bridge was one of the city's busiest entrances, crossed by merchants, travelers, and citizens daily, which turned the sight of the head into a constant reminder of the English crown's strength. It was not merely an act of personal humiliation against Wallace, but also a strategy of psychological domination. Everyone who entered London saw the fate reserved for those who dared to challenge the king. His body was divided into 4 parts, in a process called quartering, which also held strong symbolism. Each quarter was sent to strategic cities: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. These locations were not chosen at random. They were important Scottish cities, hubs of passage, trade, or resistance, home to populations capable of being inspired or revolted by the figure of Wallace. The presence of his exposed remains in these places was like a permanent shadow of defeat, an attempt to implant fear in the hearts of the Scots. By seeing the dismembered body of a man who had been a symbol of courage and resistance, people were forced to face the reality that the fight against the English could end in a death even worse than war itself. This practice was not just a display of gratuitous violence. It was part of a medieval tradition where the body of the condemned became an extension of the punishment. The idea was to erase any dignity from the enemy, to destroy not only his life but also his memory and even the physical space where he could be remembered. By dividing Wallace into parts and scattering them, the English tried to prevent him from being honored as a martyr, avoiding a single grave where Scots could pay their respects. What Edward I did not calculate was the opposite effect this would generate. Although initially the sight of those exposed parts caused fear and silenced many, over time, the memory of the brutality of the execution and the treatment of Wallace's body turned into fuel for the resistance. What was meant to be a symbol of defeat ended up becoming a banner of courage. Many Scots came to see Wallace's sacrifice not as the end of a struggle, but as the birth of a greater cause. The fate of his fragmented body was remembered from generation to generation, and the fact that there was no grave for the hero only served to reinforce the idea that he belonged not to one place, but to all the Scottish people. The dispersal of his remains became a kind of metaphor for Scotland itself during that period, divided, pressured, and marked by pain, but still alive and resilient in all its parts. The aftermath of the body of William Wallace was not just an episode of medieval cruelty. It was a calculated attempt to impose fear and submission through the body of a man who had become a symbol of freedom. But it was also a major political miscalculation, for instead of destroying Wallace's memory, it reinforced his image as a martyr and national hero. With each exposed piece, England believed it was crushing hope, but in reality, it was multiplying Wallace's symbolic power in different places. Thus, even dead and dismembered, he continued to inspire the fight for Scottish independence and to show that certain causes are too strong to be buried, even when the body of the man who represented them was scattered to the 4 winds. The execution of William Wallace had profound political consequences that extended far beyond the fateful day he was killed. Edward I, the King of England, believed that the extreme brutality of his execution would serve as a definitive form of control, not only eliminating a dangerous rebel, but also sending a clear message to any other Scot who considered challenging English authority. Initially, the intended effect was largely achieved. Many Scottish nobles who had already submitted to England felt validated in their decision to accept English domination, and the fear of suffering a death similar to Wallace's led others to retreat from any active resistance. The public display of his death and the distribution of his remains across transformed from a military leader into a martyr, came to symbolize courage, dignity, and the struggle against oppression. The extreme sacrifice he endured demonstrated the intensity of English oppression and inspired others to continue the resistance, even in the face of enormous risks. Among them was Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland. Wallace's execution helped shape Scottish political and cultural consciousness, showing that the struggle for independence was not just a military matter, but also a moral and symbolic one. The narrative of resistance, fueled by the horror of his death, served to consolidate the idea that Scotland possessed its own national identity, capable of resisting foreign domination. Beyond Scotland's borders, the execution had broader political repercussions. Other European kingdoms watched the episode closely, perceiving England as a power that would not hesitate to use extremely cruel methods to maintain control. This influenced diplomatic relations and the international perception of England, showing that, while effective in terms of intimidation, England's reputation suffered from its excessive cruelty, fueling fears about its governance and justice. Internally, the execution also exposed the limits of power based on terror. Despite the fear it inspired, it failed to completely eradicate resistance or fully control the narrative. On the contrary, the story and memory of Wallace came to represent a political force in their own right, reminding everyone that symbols of courage and sacrifice can be more powerful than a king's army itself. Thus, Wallace's execution illustrates a classic political paradox. Acts of extreme repression can create an immediate effect of control, but they can also generate moral resistance and long-term inspiration. Edward I wanted to erase Wallace and intimidate the Scots, but he ended up contributing to the creation of a myth that would fuel the struggle for independence and strengthen national cohesion. Wallace's death, in its intensity and horror, became a catalyst for the emergence of a more united and determined Scotland, making it clear that in politics, the symbolic impact of an act often surpasses its immediate military effect. This political legacy is enduring, showing how the memory and narrative of resistance can become powerful instruments of mobilization and national identity, transcending generations and shaping the course of a country's history. The historical and modern impact of the execution of William Wallace extends far beyond his violent death on the streets of London in 1305, touching on cultural, political, and even ethical aspects that span centuries. Historically, his execution clearly revealed the level of brutality medieval rulers were willing to employ to maintain power and suppress resistance. Edward I's choice to inflict upon Wallace the punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was not merely a way to eliminate a rebel, but a carefully planned demonstration of force intended to intimidate anyone who thought of challenging royal authority. This spectacular execution, carried out before a crowd, transformed Wallace's death into a public event that simultaneously served as punishment, entertainment, and political propaganda. The immediate effect was the temporary weakening of Scottish resistance and the consolidation of English control over the population, showing how terror could be used as a tool of governance. However, in the long term, the outcome was precisely the opposite of what Edward I intended. Instead of erasing Wallace from collective memory, his execution became a symbol of courage, dignity, and sacrifice for freedom. The narrative of a man who faced death with steadfastness and refused to renounce the cause of Scottish independence turned Wallace into a moral icon, whose story inspired subsequent generations to fight against oppression. This symbolic effect is one of the earliest clear demonstrations of how historical figures can transcend their immediate context and become universal cultural references. On a modern level, Wallace's legacy remains relevant. His story is often recalled in films, books, music, and games, becoming a teaching tool about resistance, patriotism, and the fight for principles greater than individual life. Furthermore, the analysis of his execution has contributed to the development of thought on human rights and justice. The horror of the method applied to Wallace became an example of what the law and the state must not allow, encouraging debates about human dignity, the limits of power, and the need to protect even those considered enemies. Today, reflecting on his story, we realize how Wallace's sacrifice exemplifies that freedom and justice come at a price, and that acts of courage can generate impacts that outlast the individual's own life. Culturally, He has become a reference point for Scottish nationalism, helping to shape Scotland's collective identity, reminding us that the memory of past injustices can unite people and strengthen societies. Psychologically, his story demonstrates how traumatic events can be transformed into symbols of hope and resilience, teaching that even in the face of complete destruction, the human spirit can remain steadfast and inspire future generations. The historical and modern impact of William Wallace is therefore twofold. On one hand, it shows the extreme cruelty and political power of the Middle Ages, and on the other, it reveals the capacity of narrative, memory, and human morality to transform suffering into inspiration. It reminds us that acts of courage can have lasting effects far beyond their immediate context, influencing values, national identities, and even debates on ethics and human rights worldwide. And so we reach the end of the terrifying story of William Wallace, whose execution was far more horrifying and cruel than any romanticized version you've ever heard. The brutality of his death, designed as a spectacle of power and humiliation, not only marked medieval history, but also transformed Wallace into an eternal symbol of resistance and courage in the face of oppression. We hope this video has shown you the unfiltered reality and sparked a new understanding in you about the price of freedom and the lasting impact of acts of courage. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because every subscription helps us continue to bring fascinating, controversial, and mystery-filled stories like this one. We also want to know your opinion. Leave in the comments what surprised or shocked you the most in this story, because your interaction is extremely important to us and to the community that loves history and discoveries. And before you leave, don't miss the next video appearing on the screen now. It's even more interesting and captivating than this one, full of mysteries and revelations that will hold your attention from start to finish. Click and continue exploring history with us.